Hello, everybody. Welcome to our office hours session. We're excited to have everybody here for this and to give you all a chance to ask some of your questions. So let's take a look at the agenda for today. We're going to be organizing ourselves around 4 concepts. For each topic, we're going to be opening the floor to let you ask questions, but first we're going to ask you some poll questions to get a sense of where you are, making sure that you've got the key points, figuring out if there are any areas that we might really need to go over in a little bit more depth. Do also just want to say that we are going to do our best to answer all your questions. That's what office hours is all about. If we get to a question that's pretty specific to your individual situation, or if there's one where we need to do a little research to make sure we get it 100% right, we may take it back and get answers out to you separately. So just know that we will do our best to answer here. May need to get back to folks afterwards. And I will just mention that you have 2 other options besides this call. There is that MTW Asset Building Cohort email. You can always send a question in there. That is monitored several times a day. So if you have a question that's not answered here or you need some individual support, you can get it there. And happens that the MTW conference is taking place next week. So if you're going to be there, you can definitely collar somebody there and see if you can get some answers to your particular questions. So let's take a look here. These are the 4 areas in which we're going to focus our attention today. The first steps of getting rolling with MTW. A lot of you are through many of these steps, but not all of you. So we're going to do a review of that. Going to spend some time on the financial policies and procedures, move on to financial reporting, and then talk about the MTW supplement and the PHA plan. And then at the end, we'll really open it up for whatever it is that you want to be talking about. So let's go ahead and open it up for our first poll question. We're going to be thinking about the process of how you're getting from selection to implementation. So for those of you who are pretty far along, some of these questions are going to be pretty easy. That's great. I do want to encourage everybody to participate in the polls. It really helps us know where people are. If we see that everybody's getting the answers right, really helps us move along in understanding. So, Sean, if you would bring up poll question number 1. If you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see the polling section. If you don't see it open, look in the very bottom right-hand corner and see if you can get it opened up. So our first poll question is about the public process. And this is a true or false. The public process should be a collaborative process with your community that begins after selection and ends after ACC amendment execution. So it's a collaboration that begins after you're selected and ends after your ACC amendment is executed. True or false, and then click that submit button in the lower right-hand corner. And Sean, if the responses are slowing down, you can go ahead and close that poll and see where we are. All right. Had a pretty even split there on the true and the false from those of you who answered. So the correct answer is false. It is a collaborative process, absolutely true. But it begins even before the application goes in, and it is ongoing. You really want the public to be involved in your MTW activities all the way through. So as you think about public process, think about ongoing, regular interactions. You're going to hear about this a couple more times throughout the day today. This is a really important point. I think all of the MTW agencies that have gone before you will really give strong support to the idea that that ongoing collaboration with the community is really essential. So let's go on to question number 2, if we could, Sean. There it is. All right. So this one is about the board. And the question is, it's important to involve the board early in the process so they may ask questions, provide input before being asked to approve the MTW ACC amendment. Is that true or false? You should involve them early, or should you wait until you're pretty well established and bring in the board toward the end? Is it true that you should involve them early? Choose your answer and press submit in the lower right-hand corner. And Sean, why don't you go ahead and close that one out? All right, great on that one. That one is true. You really want to involve the board early so that they are well positioned to provide input on the way through things. So it looks like we definitely nailed that one. Let's go to poll number 3, Sean. All right, so this is about the MTW supplement going through the 45-day public process. Is it true or false that it goes through that process only after the MTW supplement is complete? And by complete, we mean waivers have been selected, narratives are clear and descriptive, all of the applicable attachments, so the impact analysis, the hardship policy are complete. Do you need all of those in place before starting your 45-day public process? Or can you start before that everything is done? So is it true that you have to have it all first? Click on that submit button. And Sean, go ahead and close that one out for us. All right, got a little bit of mixed thoughts on that one as well. So want to emphasize on this one that the answer is true, that the 45-day process only starts after the supplement is complete. And that means you've got the waivers, you've selected them, you've articulated them, you've got all of those attachments, you've finished your impact analysis, the hardship analysis is complete. That's all got to be done when you start that 45-day public process period. That's because the public see all of those pieces. That's really a 5-day process. It's not the first or last time you're going to be engaging the public, but for the official 45-day process, you got to make sure that you've got all of the MTW supplement materials together. As we said in the earlier poll, yes, you start earlier. Yes, you continue on. But for this specific activity, you want to make sure you've got everything complete before you start that 45-day clock. All right. That's what we've got in the way of polls to just get us remembering about what the whole process is for getting going with once you've been selected. This is an opportunity to think about this first steps point in the process. So finalizing and executing your MTW ACC amendment, thinking about the public process, thinking about how you move from selection to implementation. What questions do you have that you'd like to raise here? We've got some of our MTW experts on the phone with us who are here to answer questions for you. So go ahead and put your question in chat if you've got some. And feel free to come off mute if you want to just ask a question verbally. I'm going to give you a minute to think about what those questions are and move your fingers. I know a lot of you have gotten through these early parts of the process, so there may not be too many questions, but I want to give a minute in case there are some. All right, well, I do not know this is a shy group, so I'm going to take silence here to mean that you don't have any questions. Obviously, if you come up with some questions as we move through and you think about something that pertain to these early sections, you're welcome to ask them as we move through the slides and ask in a later point in the process. So why don't we go ahead and move to our key takeaways here. So really what we want you to remember from this segment is that communication in whatever form is really essential. You've got to figure out how are you going to engage those residents, the board, the other stakeholders. We can't say too often, you start early and you continue throughout. That communication is really essential. A lot of you have already executed your ACC amendment, but for those of you who haven't, there are a couple details here on this slide that it's really helpful to keep in mind. So needs to be a board resolution, have to have a wet signature as it goes in. It needs to go to that cohort mailbox. And remember that it is not an executed document until HUD has countersigned it. So it doesn't matter when you submit it, the date that you formally enter into the MTW demonstration program is when HUD formally signs it. So those are the couple of things that I really want to emphasize for those of you who are at that point in the process. Any other questions at this point on that early section? Okay. Then let's just take one look at some resources that that you have available to you. We're going to keep coming back to resources. These are not new from what you've seen before, but we do want to make sure that whenever you go back to one of these webinars or one of these sets of slides, you're able to easily access what you need. So here, when you think about the early stages, obviously some of those welcome webinars are going to be important. The operations notice should just be glued to your desktop because you should be looking at that frequently, as well as the cohort selection notice. The moving to work page on HUD.gov has got a lot of information about how you get through these early steps. And then there is the MTW expansion training on the HUD Exchange, which has a whole section on public engagement. So if you're wondering how to go about involving the public and who you might want to include in those processes, the public engagement materials there in the training may be helpful for you. And for those who've not yet gotten to board resolution, there actually is a sample board resolution that you can use to get you started. That's also in the MTW expansion training on the HUD Exchange. All right. With that, I think we can move on to our next segment. So we're going to talk next about financial reporting. And we are, once again, going to start with some polls to help you figure out what you do and what you don't know and what kinds of things you might want to ask about. So if we could bring up the fourth poll question, please, Sean. All right, so you should be seeing the poll on the right hand. So the question here is about timing here. Once the MTW ACC amendment is executed, reporting requirements for FDS, EPIC, and VMS change immediately. Is that true or is that false? Once that amendment is executed, do your reporting requirements for all three systems change immediately? It's true that they all change immediately. It's false. Hit submit. And Sean, let us know where people are on that one. So got a little bit of a mix here. So let's make sure that we're really clear. The answer is false. Once that MTW amendment is executed, you do not immediately change your reporting requirements. Each system has its own trigger for timing. So when we've gone through these poll questions, I think Philip can maybe talk us through what those timing requirements are, just to make sure that everybody's really clear about that piece. All right, why don't we go to poll number 5. All right, there it is. So we're talking about FDS reporting here. So MTW FDS reporting doesn't begin in the fiscal year the MTW ACC amendment is executed if the agency doesn't begin implementing funding flexibility that year. Is that true or is that false? That FDS reporting doesn't begin if the agency doesn't begin implementing funding flexibility. Couple double negatives there. I'll give you a second to make sure you're clear about your answer. Go ahead and close that one up, Sean. True. All right. Most of you got that one. It is true. FDS reporting requirements really hinge on when the agency starts using that funding flexibility. They do have to transition in their first fiscal year, as their first full fiscal year as an MTW PHA, but it doesn't have to happen immediately if you're not using that funding flexibility. So good to have that clarity there. Why don't we go to poll number 6? All right, this one we're going to be focusing on capital fund reporting. So for capital fund reporting under MTW, true or false that you will use a new BLI if you use capital funds for non-capital fund purposes? If you're using those funds for non-capital fund purposes, do you use a new BLI? Is that true or false that you will use a new BLI? Sean, go ahead and close that one up. All right, pretty good quantity of folks agree on true, and that is the correct answer. For capital fund reporting, you're going to use the usual capital fund BLIs when the funds are used for capital fund purposes. But if you're going to use non-capital fund purposes and you're going to use the funds flexibly, you need the MTW specific BLI 1492. So when you're using the funds for non-capital fund purposes, you do have to use a different BLI. Most of you got that. A few of you had that one answered in the reverse, so you want to make sure you're paying good attention. All right. Let's go on to the next question. That would be poll question 7, Sean. All right. So poll question 7 for VMS, focusing on VMS this time. The first time you will submit a report using MTW fields will be the second month after execution of the ACC amendment. So you submit the report using MTW fields the second month after execution. Is that true or false? Go ahead and close that one up, Sean. Okay, again, a little bit of a mix. So just to emphasize, the first time you use it will be the second month. That is true. That is because reporting lags by a month. So you would not start immediately after ACC amendment execution because you are not going to be reporting in that first month on MTW activities. It's the second month where you begin that kind of reporting. So that one's just a little tricky because of the lag time there. All right, want to turn it over now for questions, and I think I saw one pop up in the chat here. Let's see if I can get to that. Sunny had a question, and Sunny, you thought your mic might not be working. Do you want to try one time and see if you can come off mic? And if you can't, I'll read your question out.
I'm here. I don't know if you can hear. Okay, perfect. So I can go ahead and ask my question then. It actually has to do with waivers. We are looking at utilizing the waiver that's already in place to not pay utility allowances. But on flipping that coin, I'm curious if that waiver also covers, or if we would need to request, and if it would even be considered not paying or not billing for excess utilities. The reasons are because we have a cluster of 3 properties, all elderly disabled, right next to each other. Only one of those has separate meters where we can read the meters and bill for excess utilities. All 3 are elderly disabled. This feels really unequitable to the individuals who are residing at that one property. Furthermore, we can demonstrate that the cost to create the excess utility billing exceeds what we receive in return in that billing.
Gotcha. So I'm going to speculate that that's a pretty specific question that the MTW staff may want to work on with you sort of individually, but let me just turn that to the MTW team and just see if there's a quick answer to that, or if that would be something that Sunny should get some individual assistance on. John?
Hi everyone. Hi everyone. Yeah, John Kincannon from the MTW office. So yeah, that is a specific question, but we do have someone on our team who is a bit of a utility expert who came to us from the Energy Center here at HUD. So I would recommend, Sunny, if you could, if you could send that question to me or direct it to your field office and come to us and we could look into it. But if we're able, if that utility waiver doesn't waive the reg that you're looking for, I mean, first blush, it sounds like it's something we could probably pursue through an agency-specific waiver. But why don't you just submit that to us and we'll help run it down for you.
I'll do that. Thank you, John.
Great. Thanks for the question, Sunny. We also have one from Melissa. So she just wants to confirm, and Philip, I'll just ask you to come on and do the confirmation here if you'd be so kind. She is asking, FDS reporting becomes MTW for the next fiscal year unless we use fungibility in the current fiscal year. Is that correct?
That's correct. So during your current PHA year, if you, after you've executed your ACC amendment, if you choose to wait until the beginning of your next PHA fiscal year to use funding flexibility, then you won't have to do MTW reporting in that initial year, that initial transition year. Now, in the next full year, you can, you will need to use it. So in your first full PHA year. And there are, and we will go over this as a resource. There are questions that cover that information as well, but we will get to that in a few minutes.
Great. Thanks, Phil. Thanks for the question, Melissa. Anybody have additional questions on any of those reporting issues? Looks like you nailed that one for Melissa. Philip, thanks, Melissa. Other questions?
Hi, Janet.
Lindsay. Hi.
I don't have a question specifically on reporting. It's more financial related. So is this a good time to ask that?
Sure, go ahead and ask. And if Philip feels like it would fit better a little later after he's covered some other things, he'll let us know.
Okay. And I think, yeah, this is going to be a question for the MTW team who may not be able to completely answer it. But so we got our funding letters this week. And I was a little bit surprised by some of the language that was in the funding letters, including some stuff that was specific to fiscal year 23 that's applicable to the original MTW PHAs, but not the expansion MTW PHAs, but also the one that says, so it says, except for the initial 39 MTW PHAs, HAP funds provided under the 2023 Act cannot be used to incur in overleasing, to support prior year deficits, or provide for administrative expenses, nor may they be loaned or transferred to cover other program obligations such as low rent or capital fund programs. So to me, that confused the whole fungibility aspect a little bit, but I'm wondering if this means, is it only the 2023 funds that cannot be used to overlease? Can reserves be used to overlease? And then from a fungibility perspective, when it says program obligations, does this mean those that are true obligations, right? So maybe contracts that are already entered into.
Thanks for the question, Lindsay. John, looks like you might want to take that one.
We can always rely on Lindsay for the hard questions. Lindsay, I honestly don't think that letter was run by our office. So there you have full fungibility of your funds, including the 23 funds. It's written into the appropriations language that all MTW agencies can lease above their ACC limit. So I think we'll have to check with our friends in the voucher office and on that language, because I agree that is confusing, because you have the full fungibility of funds, And I don't know, Philip, if you want to add anything there. I'm a little confused, frankly, by that language because it just doesn't sound right.
So
So
are we.
actually ask, so what I would actually ask you to do, and I've been told that like people can't hear me, so hopefully by me speaking louder, you can hear me now. What I would encourage you to do is to submit your question to the asset building cohort inbox so I can have the like exact wording, and we will probably have to touch base with the financial management division, the HCV financial management division to look into that further. But like that language that's in that letter, we are usually asked to review those the funding letters before they go out, and I can tell you that we were not asked to do that this year. So yeah, just if you submit your question to the asset building cohort inbox, we will take a look at that and get back to you as soon as we can.
Thank you guys
Great.
so much. Now I'll be able to sleep tonight.
Yeah, and presumably that may apply to others who've received funding letters. So I'm sure the MTW office will figure out about communication about that as needed. So thank you, both John and Philip. And great question, Lindsay. Thank you for that. Other questions from folks right now?
53/73, 72%.
All right, looks like Rand, you need to either mute or if you had a question, let us know. All right. Okay, I think at this point I want to turn it over to Philip to just do some key takeaways on this segment. So Philip, take it away.
Okay, great. So, okay, everybody. I'm just going to cover a few quick points before we transition to the next section. So, I just want to first point here that we have is that the timing of FDS, EPIC, and VMS reporting changes is based on the execution of your ACC amendment, your MTW ACC amendment. Most of you all have submitted those to HUD for processing, and so there's just a handful left who have not submitted yet. But we're going to actually pull up that slide in just a second to go over those. But I want to make the last point here, and then we will pull up that slide. So the next point is that expansion agencies need to have systems in place in order to trace funds from source to final use. This includes maintaining your internal accounting records and your general ledgers and trial balances to differentiate fund balances for all voucher types. And so ICF, based on the poll questions, can we pull up the slide that covers the how the ACC amendment execution affects the systems reporting, please? I don't have the slide off the top of my head here. Okay, so I just want to really quickly go over this slide because this was based on the poll questions. So to start off with, we're going to cover the FDS. So with FDS, the trigger for change is going to be when you choose to use funding flexibility. So this is a bit of a repeat from earlier, but in that initial transition year during your PHA operating fiscal year, after you execute your ACC amendment, you do not have to start using the MTW reporting instructions if you don't use funding flexibility. So in that initial transition year, you only have to switch to the MTW reporting instructions if you start to use funding flexibility. After that initial transition year, during your first full PHA operating fiscal year, as an MTW PHA, that's when you need to start using the MTW reporting instructions. Okay, so we've covered that. With the capital fund system, the trigger for change for that is going to be the ACC amendment execution itself. So once you execute your ACC amendment in EPIC, you'll start using budget line item 1492 for non-capital fund eligible expenses and cease using that BLI 1406, which is transfer to operations. And then finally, and this is the last point I want to cover, is VMS reporting. And so That trigger for change is also going to be the MTW ACC amendment. So in that initial month, because VMS reporting lags behind, you will, you will have that initial month where you're still reporting as a non-MTW agency, and that first full month as an MTW agency for the following month, you will then start reporting as an MTW agency. So the example I like to give is actually, ICF, could you pull up slide 33? Because I think that really does a good job of illustrating that point a little bit better. Okay, so we're going to take this example from the earlier webinar. So let's say you execute your fully executed ACC amendment this says December of 22, but we're just going to use a current example. So let's say you are fully executed as of April 1 of 2023. So that's what the first little graphic shows. The second graphic, let's just say that says May instead of January. So in May, you're going to do your April reporting. So you're not going to use the MTW. Sorry, yeah, you're going to do your. Did I do this right? Okay, April 1 fully executed. So it's always a month behind, right? So the bottom line is you would not do April reporting until May. So, and so that's sort of the point. So it's always going to lag behind a little bit. Just using this example on the screen, you're fully executed in December. In January, you do your December of 2022 VMS reporting. And then in January 23, you go through that month, and that's your first full month. And then that's how that transition works. And I actually think there might be an error on this slide. But yeah, so anyway, let's move on. But just basically think about it this way: there's the base month where it's just lagging 30 days behind. So that's the easiest way to think about that. So let's go back to the earlier slides, please. Slide 16, I believe. Sorry, slide 13. Okay, so these are some really important resources that are available to you as we transition you, as you transition through the MTW program. So the first link is to section 5 of the MTW operations notice. That's going to have all of the information on funding flexibility. That also covers how the different funding sources are calculated. So that is a great resource that has all of the sort of the information that we covered in the training, both in December, January of 2023. The next link is actually to the FDS, the special reporting instructions for MTW agencies. I would highly encourage you to bookmark that page and have that with you. The third resource is really specific to, it's a more granular resource that really goes into line by line what the definitions for each of those FDS line items stand for, and it has a more granular level breakdown of, it goes into a lot more detail than our special reporting instructions do. The fourth resource is really covering a lot of how the ACC amendment execution process, the MTW ACC amendment execution process affects reporting and the things that we just covered. The fifth and sixth links are to the VMS user manuals. The first link, that's the really in-depth guide. That's sort of more of a handbook. And then the next one is basically a snapshot of that longer manual. So it's really, I recommend having those both bookmarked, but I think on a sort of, if you have a quick question, I would recommend using the second resource just because it's something you can kind of go into and pull as you need it. And lastly, the last link is a link to our special purpose voucher frequently asked questions. And that's a really comprehensive resource that goes through all of the different special purpose vouchers type, what fields they should be reported in VMS for MTW agencies. And it also has some other related FAQs around admin flexibilities and the applicability of those to special purpose voucher types. And it also has some other information about 50058 reporting as well. Okay. And then I think with that, we can transition to slide 14.
Great, thanks, Philip. And I'm going to take it from there, and we're going to do another round of poll questions. We're going to be moving from financial reporting on to actual financial policies and procedures. So, Sean, if you could bring up poll number 8, please. All right. So we're trying to think about what does it mean to have MTW funding flexibility. We got 3 choices for you. Choice 1, using operating capital and HCV funds for purposes they were not originally appropriated for, or applying MTW administrative flexibilities. Choice 2 is MTW PHAs can expend their HCV capital and operating funds for any purpose. And choice C is completing the MTW ACC amendment execution process. Which of those is the definition of MTW funding flexibility? And remember to hit submit in the bottom right-hand corner. And Sean, go ahead and close that. All right, looks like a lot of us got that one right. The answer is A. MTW funding flexibility means using those different types of funds for purposes they were not originally appropriated for, or being able to apply MTW administrative flexibilities. So that's what we're looking for there. Let's go ahead and look at question 9. So timing. When can an MTW agency begin using funds flexibly? Is it the day after they sign the ACC amendment, the first of the month following MTW AC amendment execution by HUD, or the day the MTW supplement to the PHA plan is approved? Which of those is when you can begin using your funds flexibly? Hit that submit button. Sean, go ahead and close that. Most of us got that one right again. B, it is the first of the month following MTW ACC amendment execution by HUD. That's when you can start using the funds flexibly. That doesn't speak to when you can start doing activities that require waivers, but using funds flexibly can start on the first of the month following execution. All right, let's go to poll 10. So once that supplement is approved, funding flexibility is allowable under all of the PHA's funding sources. Is that true or false? Once you've got an approved supplement, funding is flexible under any of your funding sources. True or false? Hit submit. And Sean, go ahead and close that one. All right, we've got a pretty even split on this on the true and false. So this is one you may want to cover pretty carefully when we get to it, Philip, and that is once the supplement is approved, funding flexibility is not allowable under all funding sources. Under some sources, yes, but not under all. And so we'll try to go over and help be really clear about when that funding flexibility is indeed allowable. Great to know that there's a need for a little bit more on that topic. Let's go to poll 11. All right. Which renewal funding calculations change under MTW? So we're thinking about those renewal funding calculations. What changes? Is it the HCV HAP renewal calculations, the public housing renewal calculations, or HCV housing administrative payments calculations? What changes under MTW? Sean, go ahead and close that one. All right, this looks like another good one for us to cover, Philip. The answer is C. Only HCV HAP is calculated differently. The HCV HAP admin fee, operating and capital funds are calculated the same as for non-MTW PHAs. Actually, I think that my key here is wrong. The answer is HCV HAP is calculated differently. So that would be A, and it looks like we still have a mix, but not as big a mix as I thought we had. So I think we should cover that one, Philip. Which renewal funding calculations do change under MTW? And then poll question 12. Here we got it. So virtually all obligation, expenditure, and requisitioning processes change under MTW. Is that true? Do all of your obligations, all of your expenditure, and all of your requisitioning processes change under MTW? True or false that they all change? Sean, go ahead and close that one. And we've got a pretty good mix on that one too in terms of responses. What we're looking for is to say that is false. That's because all of the obligation and all of the expenditure activities remain the same as they were without MTW. And in fact, even for requisitioning, only some things change. So by and large, obligations, expenditures, and requisitioning, there's not very much change under MTW. So maybe we want to go over that a little bit to make sure everybody's clear about what is and what is not changing. So let's go to our next slide. So those are our poll questions. Want to make sure that we take a minute to see what questions you may have about financial policies and procedures before I turn it over to Philip for a little bit of review. Any questions anybody wants to put in the chat or come off mute and ask? Give everybody just a minute here. Right, I'm not seeing much action here in the chat. So Philip, why don't I go ahead and turn it over to you? You can go ahead and go over some of the key takeaways, and then we can see if people have more questions after that.
Okay, sounds great. If we can move to the next slide, please. So when we're talking about funding flexibility, they're referring to using operating capital and HCV funds for purposes that they were not necessarily originally appropriated for, or using MTW admin flexibility. So an example we gave here is the use of op funds to issue additional HCV vouchers. That's something that would not require a waiver through the MTW supplement process. And when we're talking about administrative flexibilities, we're talking about things like, for example, some of the waivers in the MTW supplement that address things like triennial income recertification, or some other different things with payment standards and things of that nature. So that's also what we, MTW status essentially provides. So the funding sources that are covered under MTW funding flexibility are going to be your capital funds, your op funds, and then HCV, and that covers both the housing assistance payments, HAP, and HCV administrative fees. So all of those funding sources can be used flexibly. So the things that cannot be used flexibly, and this is why we had that question, and why it's a little bit tricky is that multifamily PBRA. So basically programs that are funded through the multifamily, the Section 8 PBRA program, that cannot be used with a MTW funding flexibility. Those funds have to be used for Section 8 PBRA, and then also special purpose vouchers. So as you all maybe recall from either the November or January trainings, special purpose vouchers are vouchers that have been earmarked by Congress for a specific line item purpose. So some of really common examples that we see with our agencies are things like the HUD Cash program. Let's see, the EHV, the Emergency Housing Voucher Program. Those are specific funds that were allocated by Congress to basically target and serve a specific population. So in the case of HUD Bash, that would be homeless veterans. And then EHV is going to be those who are either homeless or at risk of homelessness, that type of thing. So that's just something to keep in mind, that MTW is not a blanket waiver for you all to use all of your funding sources flexibly. It's limited to capital, operating, and then HCV HAP, housing assistance payments, and HCV administrative fees. Those are the things that you can use with funding flexibility. Obligation and expenditure requirements are largely the same. So, we're going to cover that slide in just a second. And then the requisitioning requirements really only change for CAP funds and HCV, but it doesn't change for the op fund. And then in terms of how funds are calculated themselves, operating and capital funds remain absolutely the same. So the way that they were calculated prior to you becoming an MTW, that's going to carry forward after you become an MTW agency, okay? And in terms of HCV funds, and this is referring to, when we say HCV, we're referring to both HAP and admin fees. There's not going to be any change to how you earn administrative fees, but the HAP portion of the HCV funds is what changes. So ICF, and actually to sort of better illustrate this point, let's bring up slide. Let's bring up slide 36, please. Okay, so this is a really useful little chart that just goes over in a little bit more detail. So as you can see, for operating funds, the way that funds are calculated, obligation and expenditure requirements and requisitioning, there is absolutely no changes for op fund. So just think about this at the end of the day. With op fund, basically nothing is changing in terms of either requisitioning, the way that your funding is calculated, and also any obligation expenditure requirements. Nothing is changing. All right, let's cover cap funds. So for cap funds, the way that your capital funding is calculated and the obligation and expenditure requirements for capital fund, those are absolutely the same. So again, there's no changes for those two things. The only change for capital fund is in the requisitioning process, and that is specifically just for the use of capital funds for non-capital fund eligible purposes. So for example, this is not the only example, but just for example, let's say you want to use capital funds, and let's just assume your MTW supplement is approved, okay? We're making a lot of assumptions here, but this is just for illustrative purposes. But let's say your MTW supplement is approved and you want to use some of your capital funds to pursue a local non-traditional activity, what we call L&T. You would use BLI 1492 for that instead of 1406. So that's the only change for capital fund, okay? So HCV funds, in terms of HAP, the only thing that's changing for the funding calculation is going to be HAP. And we're going to cover that actually in another slide because that's something where we always get a lot of questions about. There's no changes to the obligation expenditure requirements since those funds are know your money. And then in terms of requisitioning, your payout is, your disbursement is going to be based on your reporting and expenditures in VMS unless your current expenses exceed your disbursements. And then if you want to request non-HAP expense disbursements, those can be done by contacting your FA in the Financial Management Center, which is going to be Leslie Bowman for you all. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so let's cover this really quick because I think this is a question that we get pretty often, but let's just refresh our minds from back in January, because it's been several months now, about how your HCV HAP is going to be calculated. So remember, this is a two-step process. The first is we're going to calculate what's called the HAP, the MTW HAP renewal eligibility cap. And then the second thing we're going to calculate is your actual HAP and non-HAP eligible expenses. So let's cover the HAP renewal eligibility cap. So that's a lot of words for saying what we're going to do is take your pre-MTW per unit costs. We're going to inflate it, whatever the inflation factor is. We're going to inflate it, and then we're going to multiply it by the total number of eligible ACC units that you have for the HCV program, okay? So that's a really fancy way of saying we're going to take your PUC, inflate it, and then multiply it by your total number of ACC units that you have. That's step one. Next, what we're going to do is calculate your re-benchmark year's actual HAP plus non-HAP eligible expenses. And that's a really simple equation that HUD will pull from VMS data reported throughout the year. And so we'll add your eligible HAP expenses plus your eligible non-HAP MTW expenses, and then we'll get the total expense calculation based on your eligible expenses. So then what we will do is your total HAP eligibility for that calendar year will be the lower of those two. So let's say we calculate your MTW renewal eligibility cap as $4 million, okay? But then your eligible expenses that and let's just use calendar year 22 because that's the most recent example of a completed year. In calendar year 2022, your actual eligible HAP and non-HAP eligible expenses were $5 million. So in that case, your HAP renewal eligibility would be $4 million because that's the lower of the MTW HAP renewal eligibility cap versus your eligible total HAP or your total eligible expenses of HAP and eligible non-HAP MTW expenses. So we take those. So just to sum it up, it's a two-step process. We start by calculating your HAP renewal eligibility cap. Then we calculate your eligible total expenses, and then we take the lower of those two, and that's how we derive your HAP renewal eligibility for that year. And then I see if we could transition back to slide 16. So those are the things that we covered today. And I also just want to take a second before we start answering some of the questions, because I think there's a couple of questions that came in the chat, is if you all recall in this webinar, we had an excellent presentation by Maria Razzo, and she had a lot of really helpful insights as an initial MTW PHA. They've been around since I believe 2008, if I recall, and they are a relatively large agency, but I would encourage you all to take a look back at that presentation and especially listen into her remarks, because she had a lot of really useful and salient things to say as an initial agency who's been around for about 15 years. So I would encourage you all to take a look at that presentation again, because and you can actually find that on the HUD Exchange. The recording to that is on the HUD Exchange, so you can go back and look at either this webinar or any of the other previous webinars in the series to refresh on anything that we've covered. So I just wanted to point that out because I think that's an important, she had a lot of really useful information to say. So I really would encourage everybody if there's something you're trying to take into account in your financial policies and procedures, to really go back and take a look at her presentation, because she had a lot of really excellent suggestions. And then my final point is just recall that even with MTW 2 CFR Part 200 still applies. I know that's not a bullet point on the slide, but I think that's really important to cover, is that a lot of those, what we call cross-cutting requirements, things like Part 200, FHEO, all of those things still apply, even after you become an MTW PHA. So just keep that in mind. So Janet, I believe we had some questions come in.
We do, Philip. And if you could just right away repeat the name that you just gave for who people should be looking for.
Sure, it is Maria Razzo, and Maria Razzo. She's at the Housing Authority of San Bernardino. She is the executive director, and I believe her email address is actually in the slides for that presentation, or her somebody else that works in her office. I think her name is Nicole. So I think both of their email addresses are in that presentation. If you have any questions that come up, maybe regarding her presentation, if you go back and watch it again, because I think it's a really helpful PHA. I think it's really helpful to hear from the PHA perspective, from an agency who is doing the boots on the ground work and has really kind of had to work through all of these different things around funding policies and procedures and any changes to internal accounting systems, things like that. It's always really helpful to hear that from the PHA perspective, because we at HUD can tell you what the requirements are, but sometimes I think it's really helpful to be able to get that perspective from the agency who has gone through that and has really had to figure out, this is what we needed to do in order for us to be successful after we became MTW.
Thanks, Philip. And for those of you looking at the chat, Eva did put Maria's name in there, so you've got the correct spelling. There was a question about special purpose vouchers. And so Melissa asks, do the special purpose vouchers include mainstream and FUP?
Yes, and actually both of those SPV types are actually covered in the FAQ. So every one, I believe, of HUD's SPVs that we have that have been allocated by Congress through appropriations language have a section in the SPV FAQ where it addresses those things that I just mentioned about admin flexibilities, where they report in VMS, things around the 50058. So I really encourage everyone to bookmark that resource, because it is really great in that in covering a lot of those questions you might have.
Yeah, so it's a great resource. I agree, Philip. I've seen a couple people flash up on camera. I don't know if that's because you'd like to actually ask a question, or you're just being friendly. So anybody want to come off mute and ask a question?
I see there's a question that came in from Lindsay Reams at Grand Rapids. It says, I know you can't funds from SPV programs, but can you funge funds into the SPV program? But can you be a little bit more specific about what you're trying to do there? Like, is there a specific purpose in mind, or are you just asking theoretically?
I'm just really asking theoretically. So I know we can't take funds from like EHV or mainstream to, do other capital stuff or operating HCV stuff. But could we use capital funds to add funds to our special purpose voucher programs, so that we could potentially lease to more families in those special areas?
Yes, and I know we've gotten some questions too about funds that cover with funding flexibility to do things like landlord incentives. So the answer is yes. But I would also say, if you have a specific question about something as you come further down the road, like as you're getting into the, you're starting to do your supplement, or if you've already submitted your supplement and you kind of are thinking of things, I would always just encourage you to run that and submit a question to the asset building cohort inbox, just because we want to just make sure, because sometimes there's there's extenuating factors and circumstances. So just, I think is if you get into more specifics, I would encourage you to reach out to us and submit a question in writing when you get a more sort of specific use, just so that we can provide you with the best guidance possible. So that's what I would just say about that.
Thanks, Philip. And I was just going to add to that. Yeah, no, and I think it's a pretty common activity we see. The initial 39 agencies kind of supplementing what is happening with their special vouchers, special purpose vouchers. So as Philip said, oftentimes around landlord incentives. So if you're hiring, say, if you wanted to use some of your capital funds or your traditional voucher funds to, say, hire a housing navigator to help your EHV clients or your HUD-VASH clients, you can absolutely do that. So the special purpose funds have to stay within special purpose, the purposes for which they're appropriated, but you can use your fungibility to the other way to take traditional funds and move them into and support those special purpose households.
Looks like we've got a follow-up. Lindsay, you want to just go ahead and ask your question verbally?
Yeah, so just we're doing tons of research here on the back end trying to find answers ourselves, but how does HUD determine, where do you get what non-HAP eligible expenses are? Are you only, because one of the resource documents says that an example might be development activities. Are you using just what's reported on VMS, or do you get that information somewhere else?
Well, I will say I did have a conversation this week. We were looking to possibly clarify that language in the VMS. The user guide has information, additional information about sort of non-HAP, but we're looking for, what are if you're using something outside of the traditional allowed uses under Section 8, it would go into sort of that non-HAP eligible expenses. Does that answer your question, Lindsay?
Yes, it does. I just wanted to make sure it does, kind of, right? I just wanted to make sure those items are reported somewhere, right? Like, and it sounds like you guys are contemplating maybe some changes in VMS for various line items, which I think might clarify that as well. But it does sound like you're going to get, in order to find what that number is, the non-HAP eligible expenses, we've got to report that somewhere, and it sounds like it's going to be VMS.
If it's voucher funding, correct. If you're using voucher funding for non-HAP eligible.
Okay. All right. Got it. Yeah. Got it.
And we were joking, and so your voucher funds are only reported in VMS. And Joe Russell on our team is the lead on this issue. I was saying he should set up a booth at the MTW conference, but I would try to track him down, and if you don't know who Joe is, I'll introduce you. But any sort of VMS questions there?
All right, and I'll try, John, not to be your biggest thorn.
Oh, these are great questions.
Absolutely. All right. Anything else before we take a look at the resources? Okay, we'll have another open question session at the end, so if anything else comes to mind, we can get that in. But Philip, you want to take us to the next slide?
So if we could advance to slide 17, please. Okay, so, all right, now I have the exact dates. That's right. We had done so the first link that you see here on the screen is the link to the finance series that we have done over the last couple of months, towards the end of last year, beginning of this year. So the first webinar you can find the link for, and that's to the financial reporting webinar, which covers a lot of stuff that we just talked about earlier about VMS reporting, FDS, Cap Fund, and other related systems. And that's where you can also hear from our colleagues at the Capital Fund. That's the first link in the webinar. The second webinar is what I was referring to earlier. This is about financial policies and procedures. And this is where we have, this is the second link is where you can go to review the presentation that Maria Razzo did. You will find that in the second link there, and that's where she went into quite a bit of detail about, you know, the things that they have learned as an MTW agency as it pertains to just sort of funding flexibility in general, and then also some specific insights around things like what system changes they made and their internal accounting systems, things of that nature. So that's where you can find that information. The third link is actually a webinar that will go into a lot more detail about funding flexibilities, how funds are calculated. That was actually, gosh, it's hard to believe it's been almost 2.5, 3 years at this point, but we did that one back in October 2020. And that webinar will also cover things like statutory requirements of MTW as well. So that's what that third link is there under the expansion webinars. As we've covered, section 4.5IB of the operations notice has a lot more information. And in addition to these webinars that we did, there is also an MTW online training manual. And there's 2 modules that are covered around this topic of sort of funding flexibility, financial reporting. The first one is a module on understanding and using funding flexibilities, and the second one is about operating MTW with other programs, so things like RAD and SPV. So those are 2 really helpful online trainings, and that second link in particular is not something that we went into a lot of detail on during the finance series training. So I would encourage you to check those training modules out. And I believe at this point we can transition, I'm going to turn it back over to Janet to transition us to the supplement system, I believe.
Don't go anywhere just yet, Philip. There was one other question that came in. It didn't go to everyone, so you wouldn't have seen it. But there's a question asking if we can use HCV funds on RAD PBRA properties. So I don't know if that's something you can answer, or if John can, or if we need to get back to people. HCV funds on RAD PBRA properties.
So is this a Section 8 PBRA, or is this PB? John, I'm actually going to turn this one over to you. I think is the
sure. So we spell this out actually in the RAD notice. You can use your MTW funding for RAD PBV, but not for RAD PBRA. It's because basically once you go PBRA, it kind of leaves the PIH kind of platform, and you go over to, you're over in the multifamily office here. So for that reason, we've seen, I would say, the vast majority of RAD conversions under MTW go to stay in the project-based voucher kind of platform rather than PBRA. So, but if you want more detail on that, it's spelled out in the RAD notice.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. All right, so we are going to transition to thinking about the MTW supplement to the PHA plan. And we're going to switch to Allison as our resource on this. So if we can go ahead and get the poll question 13 brought up. All right, so once you have carefully planned out your MTW activities, it doesn't take much thought to just write that MTW supplement. Is that true or false? Once you planned it out, it doesn't take much thought to write the supplement. True or false? Sean, go ahead and close that one down. I think we all agree that is false. It takes a lot of thought to actually put together a really good supplement, and it looks like pretty much everybody has got that picture of what it's going to take. So that's great. Let's go to poll question 14. So is it okay to post only the MTW supplement narrative to start the public comment period, and then add the impact analysis and hardship policy before the public hearing after you get those completed? So is it okay to just post that narrative start the public comment period, and then add the impact analysis and hardship policy? Yes or no? Is that okay? Go ahead and close that one up, Sean. Most of you got that one. No, that would not be okay. You have to have the whole package there in order to start that public comment period, because the public's got to be able to see the whole package to understand what's being proposed. So really important that you finish that impact analysis, finish that hardship policy, get it all together before you actually start that public comment period. Absolutely be getting input from public all the way along, but the formal public comment period, you got to have the whole thing ready to roll. Give us 15 if you would, please, Sean. So the MTW agencies need to flesh out the hardship policies associated with their MTW waivers. The MTW operations notice does not provide sufficient detail. Is that true or false? Do MTW agencies need to flesh out their hardship policies further than what's shown in the MTW operation notice? True or false? Go ahead, Sean, and let's see what people thought. Little split on this. The answer we're looking for here is true. There is good information in the MTW operations notice, obviously, but while it specifies what hardship policies are required, it's up to the agency to really develop those policies in a way that you can really operationalize those. So what's in the operations notice is key, critical, important, but not sufficient. You have to go beyond that to make sure it's been well operationalized for your program. Let's have the next one, Sean. All right. I'm looking for 100% accuracy on this response. Public engagement is an essential element of the MTW process. Is that true or false? Public engagement is essential. Sean? All right, we did it. 100% accurate on that one. Yes, public engagement is critical. Really important that you keep that front and center. And then slide 17, please, Sean. Question 17. All right, so when can an MTW agency begin implementing activities that require HUD approval? So we've talked about the funding. This one's acting about the activities that require HUD approval. Can they begin those the day after they sign the ACC amendment, the first of the month following the MTW ACC amendment execution by HUD, or the day the supplement to the PHA plan is approved and the ACOP and admin plan are updated? When can you begin implementing activities that require approval? Sean? Almost everybody got this one. It is in fact C, the day that the MTW supplement is approved. Got to have that approval if you're going to be using the waivers, and you have to update your ACOP and your admin plan appropriately. So great thoughts from everybody on that, and I'm going to turn it over to Allison to take us to our next slide.
Great. Thank you, Janet. Hello, everyone. Good to see you again here today. Before we get into just some general tips on the supplement and going over the information that we've already given you there, we've been getting some questions about the cohort specific waivers for the asset building cohort and how to go about getting those implemented, getting your asset building activities implemented. So we just wanted to have a quick slide there to go over that. So as you know, if you were in the savings account option in the selection notice, there's a specific waiver that's contained in the selection notice. So that is a special waiver that's only available to PHAs in this cohort. So it's contained in the selection notice, therefore not in the operations notice. So there is a kind of a different way that you go about invoking that flexibility. So what you will do if you are in the savings account option, or if you're in the PHA designed option and you have a savings component as a part of that, you'll want to invoke this cohort specific waiver that's in the selection notice. So it's cohort 5.1, A, I think for public housing, and B for vouchers. So that will be dependent on what households are, getting access to that savings account. So in order to implement that waiver, you'll just need to, there's not a special place in the MTW supplement to do that, since again, it's not available to all PHAs, it's just available to PHAs in your cohort. So what we've been asking PHAs to do is to attach it as you would an agency specific waiver. So there's a place in the supplement when you're going through the online system where it says, do you have an agency specific waiver? Do you have a safe harbor waiver? So there, just click yes that you do. And then you'll be able to go ahead and attach just the narrative for your cohort specific waiver as a PDF. So you don't have to do the elements of the agency specific waiver. So it's not necessary that you do a hardship policy or an impact analysis. It's not necessary that you have a separate public hearing for this activity, but just as a way to append that cohort specific waiver to the supplement, you'll want to, use the waiver as it is in the selection notice, provide some narrative information on what your specific program is, and then include that as a PDF that's attached to your MTW supplement when you submit it. So that's a way that we can get that information into the MTW supplement system so that your MTW desk officer in the field office can review that information. So that is for the savings account option. And again, the PHA designed option, if you have a savings component. For those PHAs in the credit building option, or if you're in the PHA designed option and you only have a credit component, there's actually not specific MTW flexibility you need to do those things. So there would not be something specific in the MTW supplement you would need for those, because you could do that if you were non-MTW. So again, I know we talked about this a lot at the community of practice, but we're getting the evaluation design finalized and we're getting the research team in place. So we do ask that you wait for enrollment to do enrollment of those just asset building activities, not your whole MTW program, but just the specific asset building activities until the evaluator is ready to work with you on selecting households and doing enrollment. But in order to kind of get your ducks in a row to get those activities ready to go, that's how they would be reflected in your MTW supplement. So I think that covers that slide. If we want to go to the next one. Any questions on that cohort specific waiver process? All right, well, hopefully I answered the questions that we had. Give it a minute. All right, great. And if you have any, trouble attaching things or trouble with the system or anything like that, remember that your field office and your, is your great resource for that. And then they can bring in the desk officer or me and the research team as needed if you have specific questions on your asset building activities. So let's go to the next slide then. And we'll cover just some kind of a key takeaways on the MTW supplement, which I'm sure is on the top of everybody's mind right now as you're trying to get your MTW program started. So we use the MTW supplement as a way to summarize what you'll be doing in a way that makes your plans clear to the public. So remember, as you're creating your supplement, that it's not just for your agency and HUD to look at, that it's really for your community and other stakeholders to review as well. So you want to be using plain language. You want to be providing context in the descriptions for your waivers and activities. Don't just check the button. Make sure you write at least a couple sentences or a paragraph on what it is you're planning to do, so that it's real clear to everyone what kind of MTW flexibilities you'll be using in your MTW supplement. And then also keep in mind that you have the body of the supplement, which is that the form, the HUD 5075 that you'll be using, but there could be some attachments that you need to include as well. So the MTW supplement system will ask you, maybe you might have to put them in yourself, but you'll be including attachments depending on the types of activities and waivers you'll be planning to implement. So it could be the case that you need an impact analysis and a hardship policy if you're utilizing MTW waivers that require those in the safe harbors. You'll definitely need to be providing documentation of your public comments and how the agency addressed them. So that's going to be a kind of a a PDF attachment to the supplement, your certifications of compliance, which is the that list of certifications, and then a signature at the end that's included as a part of the form. There's also, it's included in the 5075, but if you go to the MTW supplement resources page, we have that just as its own attachment, so you don't have to, pour through the PDF and print out pages 17 and 18. It's really easily accessible right there for you to just print out and use. So that's going to be required with every MTW supplement submission. And then if you are doing any safe harbor waivers, any agency specific waivers, or any cohort specific waivers, make sure you include all the required information associated with those as attachments as well, since those will be requiring a lot more information. And I think we probably said this in the MTW supplement webinar, but just to kind of keep in mind that you have a lot of time in MTW, a lot of time to do some really creative and cool things. So don't feel like you need to, get all your safe harbor waivers and agency specific waivers out the door right off the bat. You have plenty of time to kind of get your feet wet and start your MTW program. So, if you're not submitting safe harbor waivers and agency specific waivers with this first submission, we generally think that's a good idea to just kind of get a feel for the program before you try, doing anything that's, through those kind of mechanisms. So the next tip we have here is to plan ahead. So the MTW supplement development process, once you're sitting down with the waivers, you're talking to your stakeholders and your staff on what you want to do with your local MTW program. You're getting all your materials together and creating those documents, which you'll then put through public process, which takes a long time. Then you have the board actions and things you need as a part of that. So we really recommend that you look at what that, PHA plan MTW supplement submission deadline is and kind of work backwards from that, so you have some milestones and a timeline to work with, because it can things can end up taking a lot longer than you anticipate that they might. And I think it's also a good idea here just to say that for the first MTW supplement, the PHA determines when that first supplement is submitted. So for instance, if you're a July 1 agency and your PHA plan is regularly due, April 15th or 16th, if you're not ready to do your MTW supplement with this submission, that's absolutely fine. It's not necessary that you submit your MTW supplement right now. If you need some more time to go through the process and develop those materials, you can always do an amended submission at some time in the year when you're ready. So if you're ready and you want to do that in first MTW supplement submission in mid-April, that's absolutely fine. But if you need some more time, that's fine too. So just kind of assess what's going on with your agency and where you are, and then do what you think is right for your organization. And we will, support that. And then once you submit that first MTW supplement, then you're kind of on the hook to do it every year. So you can't, opt not to do an MTW supplement every year. Once you submit one, then, and you're in the regular cadence to submit it every year. So it's a little bit on timing there. Another helpful tip we have here at the end is that, so the MTW supplement is a PRA approved form. So while you submit it in the MTW supplement system, there is an actual paper copy that you can look at. And we really recommend that before you just dive into the online system, the MTW supplement system, you really sit down with that form and kind of get your thoughts and ideas down on paper and what you're going to submit before you start going through that process. So really, kind of sit down and think about your program, what waivers you want to do, draft your language and get that vetted. And then once you're ready for that, then that would be the time to put it through the MTW supplement system. And then eventually, you need to submit it in that online format for your formal submission, but we think it's often helpful to sit down with a paper copy before you get going in the online system. So I think that covers everything, all our helpful tips on the slide here. And then we're happy to go over some, resources on the next slide, and then answer any questions that might be on your mind as you're digging into your MTW supplements. Now I know a lot of agencies are right in the thick of it. So on your screen here, and kind of that first and best place that I know I always go if I have a question on the MTW supplement is that MTW supplement information at HUD.gov. That's kind of a landing page for all of the MTW supplement information. So you'll find the 50075 there. you'll find that, separate certifications of compliance and different FAQs and job aids related to the MTW supplement system. So that's a great first stop. If you have an MTW supplement question, that's always where I go first. So can't go wrong. And then the next link there is to what I mentioned, that MTW certifications of compliance, that standalone document that you can just use and sign, that is technically a part of the OMB approved form, but it's kind of an easier user-friendly way of getting things actually signed. Another important resource that we always link to is the MTW operations notice. So this is where you're going to sit down with your waivers and flexibilities and really come up with the bones of your MTW program and what your agency wants to do through MTW. So that's where you're going to find the real substance of the program in that Appendix 2 that includes all of the information on the impact analysis, hardship policy, and all the the body that includes all of the different waivers and associated activities. And then, as you know, we like to give you lots of webinar resources to and other resources to help you through these first submissions. So we have all of our training resources here, MTW expansion training on waivers, specific information about how to do an impact analysis and some interactive tools there. And then a sample hardship policy that you can use in looking at your own hardship policy. Again, you really want to think about your specific activities and your specific local needs when coming up with your hardship policy. It should be tailored to your agency, but there's some great resources there to think through that element of the MTW supplement. And then, of course, the webinars here at the bottom, the ones specifically on the impact analysis and hardship policies. And then that one that Crystal did just a few weeks ago, the tips for success on the MTW supplement submission. So those are always there for them should you need it once you get started with your MTW supplement process. And I think the next slide is on any time for any questions that you might have.
I see we've got one from Tasha that we're going to go back to in a minute, but anything for Allison here on how you're thinking about the supplement and your timing and what you need to know to get through this next step in your process? Okay. While you're thinking about any other questions you may have there, John, Philip, I'm not sure if this is one that we want to tackle here. It's pretty specific, but it has to do with sort of an order of operations about drawing funds versus BLIs. John, you want to let me know if this EPIC question from Tasha is one that we want to tackle here, if she should submit that maybe to the inbox and get a specific answer to her question?
So this is referring to the question about is it FY 2022 capital funds they were planning on using in 2023, but they haven't drawn down yet. Is this the question you're referring to?
That's the one I'm referring to, the EPIC question about $60,000 of CFP 22 annual statement / budget of funds. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So actually in the December 2022 webinar that we did, Chris and actually I think Chris covered this point on, I'm just referring to slide 19 from the slides back in the December webinar about pre-FY 2022 versus post-FY 2022 allocations. So with pre-FY 2022 allocations, there's a little bit more flexibility there in terms of sticking with VLI 1492 or 1406. But unfortunately, if this is FY 2022 funds, they will need to work with their field office to revise the budget funding for that if it is FY 2022 funds that are in question here with the capital fund. So because we've made that distinction in the slides in the presentation. So there is that little bit of a differentiation. The reason why we did that is because there was going to be a large burden on the field offices for pre-22 to have to go around and switch around all those funding sources. So we provide a little bit more flexibility there. But Tasha, that's just based again, that's if you're referring to FY 2022 funds here that you have budgeted.
Thanks, Philip.
So we made the distinction. Yeah, that's just a point for everyone as well, just on that. So.
Tasha, let us know if that if you have any additional questions on that, or if that did it for you. All right. So I think we're at an opportunity here to just think about questions on any topic. Doesn't matter whether it's specific to the supplement, specific to finance, anything else that you'd like to ask while we've got the HUD crew on the line to give you information. I think knowing you have that inbox and you're going to see them at the conference in a week or so is probably tamping down your appetite for putting questions in the chat. All right, I'd like to then move on. Oh, I just saw somebody's camera pop on. Don't know if that's a question again. Okay, let's go on to the next slide then, and you can keep thinking about questions and pop them in the chat. We'll take a look before we wrap up here. So you've had a number of resource slides today. I want to just do a summary for you. So that upper left quadrant are what I'd say are kind of your core documents. You've heard about them over and over. Go to them. Your operations notice, your HUD.gov page, the moving to work expansion page, the expansion training, the webinars, the supplement web page, the online manual. There's a ton of resources out there. We've tried in this webinar to direct you to the ones that will be most useful for any particular topic that you're looking for. This is your core stuff in that upper left. And right now, most of you are in the midst of thinking about that supplement. So the other three quadrants are really going to be useful in this space that you're in right now. Bottom left, the impact analysis and hardship policies. As we've discussed, you can't start your public process for looking at your MTW supplement until you've got that impact analysis and the hardship policies really thought through. So you've got resources here that help you think about how to put those together. There is an interactive training on how to think about that impact analysis. There's a sample hardship policy as well as some training. There's a specific webinar on impact analysis and hardship policies. And of course, you've got the operations notice appendix. So there's a lot of information to help you through those two very important processes of thinking about impact analysis and hardships. Upper right, MTW system guidance. When you get to actually using the systems, you're really going to want to take a look at these resources. You don't want to look them in advance because you won't remember all of the detail, but when you are ready to use the systems listed here, take a look at these, make sure that you look at the getting started guide and the how-to guides, and that known issues on the MTW supplement module can save you a lot of time to just understand that you're encountering a problem, other people have too, and here's the workaround or the solution. So make sure you look at those when the time comes that you're ready to use those systems. Bottom right-hand quadrant, guidance for completing the supplement. Just like on the lower left, there's guidance about the impact and analysis and hardship policies. For completing the supplement itself, you've got a number of different resources here. So you've got a reference guide, you've got sections that talk about the section 7A2, the appendix 1 from the operations notice, appendix 2, all of those are going to feed into all the information you need to include in that MTW supplement. So just use those resources as you go through. You heard also today about that bottom one about the certifications of compliance, and that can just be handy for getting you through that particular requirement that you got to make sure you include. So just know that those are all out there available to you, linked in the slides and available on those key websites. I want to just go to the chat because we've got a question from Sharon. Wondering, Sharon, you want to just come off mute instead of me reading your question? You can just ask it.
Hi, I'm Sharon Oquendo. We're new to the MTW, and we're looking at waivers that look good. But I was wondering if there was a resource where other HAs have shared what are the pros and cons of the waivers. Because something might look great on paper, but then when you put it into practice, there might be more cons than pros on those waivers. So I was just wondering if there was a place where people are kind of sharing what their experiences have been with the waivers.
It's a great question, Sharon. HUD colleagues, are you aware of any systematic place that people can get this kind of information?
Hi, Sharon. I think that's a great idea. That resource does not exist. I will say, from the HUD perspective, we think a lot of these, it's how do you define good here in this situation? But I think I would, encourage you if you're looking at, say, if you're looking at some of these waivers and also looking at what some of the older MTW agencies have done. Certainly, there's a community of folks to reach out to at neighboring housing authorities to ask lessons learned and pros and cons. And if you're at the conference next week, I think that's kind of the big piece of it, sharing what agencies have tried. And MTW is a demonstration, so we provide all these flexibilities, and if you find that something's not working, you can always stop it or revise it, wherever you see fit. But we're also working, obviously this cohort's being evaluated, as are the other cohorts, so we hope to be able to start pushing out information on what we learn, some of the performance metrics and outcomes, but we're a little, that it's going to be, we don't have that yet. We're still in the early stages. And once everyone starts reporting into the supplement, kind of this online system, our kind of end goal is to be able to roll all that information up, make it public, so you can see what are some of the more popular activities, or and are they working for that community? But we'll take that back. That's a good suggestion. Thanks.
Thank you.
And I'll just suggest that we take a look at Katie's comment in the chat. She's noting that the MTW Collaborative had a resource that talked about what has worked and what hasn't, as reported by some of the other MTW agencies' annual reports. So Katie, I don't know if you have a link to that, or if that's just something that's been circulated, isn't publicly available. So maybe talk to Katie if you have curiosity about that, and we can see what HUD is able to pull up in the coming weeks and months about what they are seeing as people do their implementations.
Yeah, it was an email that was circulated to, I thought, all the moving to work agencies in our cohort, but certainly happy to forward it through to people if they reach out to me. But also I imagine next week there'll be further discussion about it as well.
Katie, if you're open to it, just pop your email in the chat so people can just ask you directly if they'd like that, maybe.
Yep, doing it now.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
I would add what Katie might be speaking about is, I think it was the MTW Collaborative, had someone a year ago pull all MTW activities being implemented, and it shows the status, kind of whether they're closed or open. I would say it's a handy tool to even just word search and look through what's happening across the country. But it's in Excel format, so I think that's probably what you're talking about, Katie.
That's correct, and it's been just absolutely phenomenal in kind of wrapping my head around, what has been done in the past, and being able to pull from the experiences of, MTW agencies who are 20 years down the track compared to where we are. So yeah, no, it's an incredible resource. So.
Great. Thank you, Katie. All right. Anybody else have a thought, question, observation? This is your office hours opportunity to ask. All right, I won't belabor it. Let's go ahead and move to our next slide. All right, so we've got a couple more things coming up for this cohort. The last in the series of onboarding webinars is looking at the HUD 50058 MTW expansion form. That is scheduled now for April 26th, and that will be the last in our formal onboarding webinar series. But then after that, as you know, we're going to be working on the asset building cohort communities of practice. And we're really thinking about ways that we can use those communities of practice to think about how are you going to be operationalizing the different elements of the asset building approaches that the groups are taking, and thinking about how you can do outreach to your communities and what kind of support you might get from a community of practice support system and all of that. So those are coming up. So stay tuned to see when those dates are going to be, and we'll get you some more detail about those. With that, I thank all of our HUD colleagues who were able to provide great information today. John, Philip, Allison, thank you all so much. And to all of you who asked great questions and participated in those polls, really super helpful. And so we will see you on April 26th for our last session. Thank you all very much for being here today. And just very quickly, Michelle, I'm seeing is the slide available to print. The slides are going to, all of the whole deck will be available on the HUD Exchange. You'll be able to get it from there, and that is printable. It's in a form you can print, so you can definitely find them there. Thanks, everybody.